In the heart of the brutal winter of 1863, when blizzards swallowed the land whole, one mother's ingenuity became the key to her family's survival. With her children in tow and the howling storm threatening to tear everything apart, she created a sanctuary beneath the snow, a lifeline hidden from the storm's wrath. Before we dive into this incredible tale of survival, let us know where you're watching from. If stories of frontier courage move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will take you deeper into the unknown. The winds had begun to howl like the cries of wolves, sending a chill down the spine of Sarah Jacobs as she looked out the cabin window. The once serene landscape was now a maelstrom of snow and ice, the blizzard creeping ever closer with violent fury. It was early December when Sarah realized that this storm, unlike any other she had endured, would not relent. For the last few days, the temperature had been dropping steadily and the forecast wasn't promising. It was the kind of storm that could trap a person for days, if not longer. And if the winds were as fierce as the forecast predicted, even the most hardened cabin could fail to protect them. She glanced at her children, Eliza, her 8-year-old daughter, and little Samuel, only 4, playing by the hearth. Their small figures were bundled in layers of wool and fur, their cheeks rosy from the warmth of the fire. Sarah knew, though, that no amount of warmth inside their cabin would stop the storm from reaching them. Her husband, Daniel, was out checking traps. He'd left just before dawn, and his return was uncertain. With each passing hour, Sarah's worry grew. She had seen the signs of this storm coming. It was going to be far worse than any they had faced before. The walls of the cabin, made of thick logs, stood firm, but Sarah knew from experience that even the toughest frontier shelters weren't invincible. The snowdrifts could block the door, and the cold would seep in if the fire dwindled. She couldn't afford to wait until the storm was upon them. She needed a backup plan, a place to keep her children safe if the storm overwhelmed the cabin. Sarah knelt in front of the hearth and whispered to Eliza and Samuel, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to go to the tunnel now, children, quickly and without a sound." Eliza nodded, understanding. Samuel, ever the curious one, looked up at his mother with wide eyes, but followed her lead without question. Sarah gathered the 2 children and led them to a small hidden door beneath the cabin, a secret place she had created months earlier, just in case. It was nothing fancy, but it was secure enough to withstand even the worst of storms. A narrow tunnel led to a small hidden room beneath the cabin, insulated from the outside world. The ground was cold and wet as they crawled through, the wind howling above them, rattling the door above them as if trying to break through. The 3 of them huddled together in the small space, their breath visible in the dim light of the lantern Sarah had carried with them. She glanced at her children, who were shivering but silent. Her heart tightened. How long would it take before the storm passed? Days? Weeks? Sarah had created the winter hearth tunnel in secret. It was her quiet act of defiance against the cruel forces of nature. As she had come to learn in her years of living in the wilds of the frontier, the elements were as much a part of life as the ground beneath her feet. They could not be controlled, but they could be outsmarted. The idea had come to her when she and Daniel had heard rumors of a nearby settler family that had been trapped in their cabin for over a week during a similar blizzard. The cabin had been sturdy, but the snow had piled so high, so fast, that the door had been sealed shut. That family had survived, but only because they had the foresight to dig a small underground space for their supplies and a backup place to hide. The idea had lodged itself in Sarah's mind and grown until she decided it was a necessity rather than a luxury. Months before the blizzard, Sarah had quietly begun to excavate the earth beneath their cabin. She kept it small, just big enough for the 3 of them, but with careful planning, she designed it so they could store food, blankets, and even a few fire-starting supplies. The entrance was hidden beneath a stack of firewood outside, accessible through a narrow, almost imperceptible trapdoor. The tunnel itself was crude but effective. The walls were supported by beams Sarah had salvaged from the logs they had cut down to build the cabin. The floor was packed tightly with dirt and snow to ensure warmth, and the ceiling was low enough that they could crawl but not stand. The room at the end of the tunnel was bare, save for a small fire pit and a stack of firewood. Inside the tunnel now, with the howling winds above them, Sarah held her children close. Her heart raced as the storm continued to rage, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. They were safe, for now. The worst of the storm was still to come, and she knew it. The snow was already piling high outside, and she could hear the wind tearing at the cabin walls. But the warmth of the tunnel, and the knowledge that they had a place to retreat if the cabin was no longer safe, gave her strength. As she looked at her children's faces, their wide eyes filled with trust and fear, she swore to herself that no matter what, she would protect them. The storm may have been fierce, but her resolve was stronger. This was the frontier, and survival was a daily challenge. But as long as she had her wits and her children, she would never give in. She squeezed their hands and whispered, "We're safe here. We just have to wait." Outside, the wind howled louder than ever, but Sarah's determination was unwavering. In that small, hidden space, they had something the storm couldn't touch: hope. The hours stretched on, each one as unrelenting as the last. Inside the small underground chamber, the storm's fury was reduced to a muffled roar, but it never stopped. Sarah sat with Eliza and Samuel, her arms wrapped around them for warmth, her heart racing with every gust that rattled the cabin above. She had tried to make the tunnel as comfortable as possible, but the reality of their situation gnawed at her. The cold, damp air clung to their clothes, making her children shiver despite the thick layers they wore. She kept the lantern low to conserve oil, its flickering light casting shadows that danced on the earthen walls. Eliza, ever the quiet one, had her head on Sarah's shoulder, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Samuel, however, was wide awake, staring into the dim glow of the lantern, his small face filled with curiosity and fear. He asked about the storm, over and over again, his voice small and shaky. "Will it stop soon, Mama?" Sarah stroked his hair gently, trying to keep her own panic at bay. "Yes, darling, it will stop soon, but we need to be patient, okay?" Samuel nodded, though his small hands gripped his mother tighter. The wind outside screamed through the cracks of the cabin, as though trying to tear the world apart. It was no longer just a storm, it had become a force of nature, one that had no mercy. Sarah glanced at the small wooden door leading out of the tunnel, the only escape route. She hadn't heard Daniel's return yet. She tried not to let the fear creep into her thoughts, but she couldn't help it. What if the storm had caught him in its grip? What if he couldn't make it back in time? She had to trust that he would, but every minute that passed without hearing his footsteps outside made the fear grow. The sound of the wind was now a constant presence, filling every inch of her mind. There was no escape from it, no way to push it away. She turned to Eliza, brushing a stray strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Do you remember the stories I used to tell you about the mountains?" Eliza nodded, her eyes blinking slowly. "The ones about the brave people?" "That's right," Sarah said softly. "Brave people who faced all kinds of dangers and kept going, no matter what. You're just as brave as they were, and we're going to make it through this storm, I promise." For a moment, the only sound in the tunnel was the wind. Then, from above, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She scrambled to the entrance of the tunnel, her heart pounding in her chest. The door creaked open, and standing in the light of the cabin's lantern was Daniel, his face wind-burned, his clothes heavy with snow. "Sarah," he began, his voice strained, "I made it back." A wave of relief washed over Sarah as she rushed to him, pulling him inside the tunnel. She wrapped her arms around him, feeling the warmth of his body, but she couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep in her gut. "I was so scared, Daniel. We've been waiting for hours. The storm is too strong." Daniel nodded, his face grim. "It's worse than we thought. There's no way we'll be able to get through it for a while. The snow's piling up fast." Sarah looked at her children, who were now clinging to Daniel, their faces filled with silent fear. "Then we stay here," she said, her voice steady but tired. "We stay here until it passes." For a moment Daniel didn't speak, his eyes scanning the darkened tunnel. He took in the cramped space, the cold, and the uncertainty that hung thick in the air. Then he turned to Sarah, his expression softening. "We'll make it through. We'll stick together." Outside, the storm raged on, but for the first time in hours, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. As long as they were together, they could survive anything. The hours turned to days. The storm outside seemed endless, its howl never ceasing. The winds howled with an unholy strength, battering against the walls of the cabin, pushing the snow deeper into the cracks. Inside the tunnel, Sarah and her family huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. The food was running low. Sarah had packed enough to last them a few days, but now that it had been more than 2 days since they had retreated to the tunnel, they were beginning to ration. The thick stew of venison and potatoes that Daniel had made before leaving for his traps was long gone, and now they had only dried jerky and a few stale biscuits to sustain them. Sarah had made a makeshift fire in the tunnel, carefully tending it with small dry twigs she had stored in the corner. The flickering light helped to lift their spirits, but the warmth was fleeting, the cold always creeping back in. Eliza had fallen ill from the dampness and exhaustion, her cheeks flushed with fever. Sarah kept a constant hand on her forehead, brushing away the damp strands of hair that clung to her face. Samuel, ever the vigilant little one, had taken to watching over his sister, tucking blankets around her and whispering comforting words when Sarah was too busy. "Don't worry, Mama," Samuel said one evening, his small hands gripping her arm. "Eliza will be okay. The storm will stop soon." Sarah forced a smile, but inside her heart was heavy. She didn't know when the storm would pass, or if it would, but she had to believe that they would make it through. There had to be a way out of this. "Thank you for looking after her, Samuel," Sarah said softly. "You're so brave." Samuel beamed up at her. "Just like you, Mama." Sarah's heart swelled with pride, though she could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. The storm had brought them to their breaking point, but her children were strong. They were all strong. And as long as they had each other, they would survive. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but Sarah found a quiet hope in the stillness of the tunnel. They were safe, for now, and she would do whatever it took to make sure they stayed that way. Days blurred into one another as Sarah and her family remained holed up in the small hidden tunnel beneath their cabin. The howling wind outside was unrelenting, pounding against the walls and windows, pushing snow into every crack and crevice. The storm had intensified, its fury showing no sign of letting up. In that confined space, with only a small lantern casting a dim, flickering light, the family existed in a strange silence, punctuated only by the sound of Sarah's steady breathing and the occasional rustle of blankets. Inside the tunnel, the air felt cold and damp despite their efforts to keep the fire going. The walls, made of dirt and timber, seemed to absorb all warmth, making it feel as though they were sitting at the edge of the frozen earth itself. Eliza, though feverish and pale, had not complained once, keeping her head nestled on Sarah's lap, her eyes fluttering closed in an almost unnatural stillness. Samuel, ever the curious boy, had grown quieter, his small fingers twitching with anxiety, but his desire to comfort his sister outweighed his own fear. Daniel had been quiet too, his presence a constant reassurance. He hadn't said much since his return to the tunnel. Perhaps, like Sarah, he was trying to contain his own unease, not wanting to show the depth of his worry. The tension was thick between them. But in the face of the storm, they had no choice but to cling to one another. Sarah glanced over at Daniel. His face was as weathered as hers, tired from the endless hours of silence and the constant worry gnawing at them. "We can't stay here forever, Daniel," she whispered. "We need to get out. If the storm doesn't stop soon, we won't make it." Daniel nodded grimly, his eyes flicking to the tunnel entrance. He had gone up to check the storm a few times already, each time returning to report nothing but a wall of white. The snow had piled so high around the cabin that the door was completely buried, and there was no telling how long it would take for the storm to abate. "I know," he replied quietly, "but if we go out there now, we risk getting lost. We need to wait until we can see." Sarah closed her eyes, her mind whirling with the possibilities. They couldn't stay in this cramped tunnel forever, especially with Eliza growing weaker. The cold and dampness were wearing them all down. But each time she thought of venturing outside into the blinding snow, a knot formed in her stomach. Samuel crawled over to her, his little hands pulling at her coat. "Mama, what happens if the storm doesn't stop?" Her heart squeezed. She didn't have an answer. She could see the fear in his eyes, and it mirrored her own. She stroked his hair gently. "We'll be okay, Samuel. We're strong. Remember?" Eliza stirred in her sleep, her brow furrowing with discomfort. Sarah reached down, brushing the cold sweat from her daughter's face, whispering softly to her, "You're going to be all right, sweetie. Just hold on." But as Sarah gazed at the dim light of their lantern, the storm outside seemed to mock her fragile sense of control. The world was slipping away from them, covered in a thick blanket of snow, and she felt powerless. Time had stopped, and yet the storm raged on, relentless and cold. Hours passed in a daze, the minutes stretching as the snow continued to fall in heavy gusts outside. The air inside the tunnel was stifling, thick with the smell of damp wood and the faint aroma of burning firewood. Sarah kept her focus on her family, doing her best to ensure Eliza's fever didn't worsen, while Samuel sat on the dirt floor, occasionally drawing pictures in the dust with his finger. Daniel, as ever, stood by the door, eyes strained as he listened for any change outside. It was in these silent, seemingly endless hours that Sarah found the most clarity. The harsh, uncaring winds outside had left them with little control over their fate. But inside this tunnel, surrounded by the people she loved, she still had something. She had strength. And as long as she had that, she wouldn't let the storm defeat them. Another day passed without any sign of the storm relenting. The sun had not shown itself for what felt like an eternity. The sky, thick with clouds and endless snow, gave no indication of hope. Every time Sarah tried to peek out of the tunnel, she was met with a blur of white. The snow had reached over the window ledge and covered the cabin door entirely, trapping them beneath layers of ice and wind. There was no way out. Eliza's fever was now dangerously high, and Sarah could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had never seen her daughter this sick before. Eliza's cheeks were flushed, her breathing shallow. The few drops of water they had left weren't enough to rehydrate her, and Sarah could see the exhaustion in her daughter's face, as if the cold itself was seeping into her bones. "Samuel," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I need you to keep Eliza warm, all right? Wrap her in those extra blankets." Samuel, his face full of concern, nodded quickly, crawling to his sister's side and carefully wrapping the blankets around her. Sarah's heart squeezed at the sight of her children, so small and fragile in this frozen wilderness. Daniel had been gone for hours, attempting to dig through the snow near the door, but each time he came back, the storm had only worsened. There was no way to even get a glimpse of the cabin's exterior. They were truly trapped. It was then that Sarah heard it, a faint scraping noise, a sound so faint that she almost doubted it. She strained her ears, hoping for another sign, and then it came again, a tapping on the door. Her heart leaped in her chest. Could it be someone outside? Could help be on the way? She quickly motioned to Daniel, who froze and turned, his face a mask of confusion. He approached the door cautiously. Sarah held her breath, her eyes wide, her heart racing in her chest. She wanted to shout out, but the fear that this could be a hallucination held her back. Another tap, this time louder. Daniel moved quickly, gathering his strength. He grabbed the shovel from the corner, his muscles straining as he pried the door open a fraction, just enough to peek outside. The snow had piled so high that they hadn't expected anyone to reach them, but now, with the storm beginning to fade, just barely, there was a chance. Suddenly, Daniel's voice broke through the quiet, thick with disbelief. "Sarah, it's a neighbor. They've found us. Help is here." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope ignite deep within her. The storm wasn't over, but help had finally arrived, and that made all the difference in the world. Sarah felt a surge of warmth flood through her body as Daniel's words registered. Help had arrived. The relief was so overwhelming it almost made her knees buckle. For days, she had been preparing herself for the worst, an endless wait in the frozen tunnel, a desperate struggle to keep her children safe from the storm and its unforgiving cold. Now, finally, someone was out there. "Help is here," Daniel repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "They've been digging their way to us. It's Thomas and his sons. We're going to be okay." Sarah had to steady herself, closing her eyes for a moment to process what this meant. Thomas and his sons lived a few miles away. They weren't close by, but when the storm had first hit, Sarah had heard Thomas's voice in her mind, that sense of community that tied them together. She had known that if they could survive long enough, someone would make the effort to reach them, but in those silent, freezing hours, it hadn't felt so certain. The storm had made the mountains seem so distant. The snow had swallowed everything. "Eliza, sweetheart, wake up," Sarah whispered to her daughter, who was still feverish and in a restless slumber. "Eliza, we're going to be okay. Help's here." Eliza stirred but didn't fully wake, still too tired to understand the significance of the moment. Sarah touched her forehead gently and reassured her. "We're going to get you back to warmth, back to safety." Samuel, who had been hovering by Sarah's side, his young face filled with silent worry, looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Mama, who's here? Who's come to help?" "It's Thomas and his sons, sweet boy," Sarah answered, forcing a smile despite the exhaustion that still clung to her. "They're going to help us. We'll be out of here soon." Samuel grinned, his eyes filled with a mixture of joy and disbelief. He had spent so much time worrying, so many hours, in the cold, waiting in the dark silence of the tunnel, to hear that someone else was out there, fighting the storm, for them. It was almost too much to believe. Outside, Sarah could hear the distant sounds of scraping and hammering, the unmistakable noises of a determined effort to break through the snow that had buried them. The weight of the storm was being chipped away, piece by piece. Daniel turned back to Sarah, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. "They've got tools, but the snow's packed so tightly. It's slow going, but they'll get through. They won't leave us." "I know," Sarah whispered, closing her eyes. "I knew they wouldn't." As the hours passed, the scraping continued. Sarah and Daniel kept close watch on Eliza, doing their best to keep her fever at bay with the little water they had left. Samuel continued to stay by his sister's side, quietly humming to her in an attempt to soothe her. The sound of hammering grew louder and more consistent, the rhythmic thudding a beacon of hope in the otherwise suffocating silence. And then, at long last, the door creaked open, a flood of cold air rushing in as the shovel broke through the final layers of packed snow. Sarah held her breath. It had to be them. In the doorway stood Thomas, his face weathered by the storm, his woolen coat covered in snow. Behind him were his two sons, equally as cold and grim, but their eyes, bright with determination, met Sarah's with something that was almost like a silent promise. "We've got you," Thomas said, his voice rough but kind. "Come on now, let's get you out of here." The tears Sarah had been holding back finally spilled over, and she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. She was free. They were free. With Thomas and his sons leading the way, Sarah and her children slowly emerged from the tunnel, stepping into the world outside, where the storm still howled, but the promise of safety was real. And for the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to believe that they would make it through, together. The storm hadn't passed, not entirely, but the weight of its grip on them had loosened. With Thomas and his sons pulling them from the tunnel, Sarah's world slowly began to take on a new dimension, one of movement, light, and safety. The cold air, while harsh against their skin, was nothing compared to the suffocating silence they had endured beneath the cabin. There was something about leaving that dark, cramped place that lifted a burden from Sarah's heart. The journey back to Thomas's cabin was slow, treacherous, and filled with uncertainty. The snowstorm had not yet abated completely, and the path was still dangerous, with drifts and wind so thick it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. But with Thomas and his sons leading the way, they moved with purpose, a steady march toward safety. Sarah held Eliza close to her chest as they trudged through the snow, the bitter wind biting at their exposed faces. Eliza had fallen into a feverish sleep in her mother's arms, her tiny body shivering beneath the layers of blankets Sarah had managed to gather. Samuel, clinging to Sarah's other side, was exhausted, but somehow managing to keep his small feet moving, his face determined. The three men worked tirelessly, creating a path through the snow with their shovels, each step a new effort to break free of the storm. They didn't speak much, their expressions grim but focused. Sarah was grateful for their silent strength. In the face of such adversity, they didn't waste time with words. They just did what had to be done. It took hours, but as the sky darkened, they finally arrived at Thomas's cabin. The warmth that greeted them inside was like stepping into another world, one where survival wasn't a daily struggle, but a distant memory. A fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with a golden glow that seemed to chase away the chill from their bones. The scent of stew and bread filled the air, and Sarah's stomach growled loudly, despite her exhaustion. "Sit, sit," Thomas urged, leading them to the fire. "I'll get some food for you all. You've been through enough." Sarah sank onto the nearest chair, finally allowing herself to relax. She felt her muscles aching, her body sore from the cold and the fear, but she couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. They were safe. They had made it. Eliza, still feverish, was laid down on a nearby cot by Thomas's wife, who had been tending to the house while her husband and sons were out. She looked at Sarah, concern in her eyes, but she didn't say a word. She simply went to work, preparing blankets and warm cloths to bring Eliza's fever down. As the stew was served, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at the small things that had kept them alive, the warmth of a fire, the kindness of strangers, the unwavering bond of family. She looked over at Samuel, who was silently devouring his food, his small hands gripping the bowl tightly. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and he smiled, a look of quiet joy on his face. "We made it, Mama," he said softly, almost as if the words were a confession, a realization. Sarah smiled back at him, her heart full. Yes, we did. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax. They were warm, they were safe, and the storm was just a memory, one they had survived together. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth slowly melting away the last traces of the cold that had gripped Sarah and her family for so long. Outside, the storm had begun to lose its fury, the winds no longer howling with the same desperate force. The snow still covered the ground, but the worst was over. The storm had passed, and with it, the dread that had lingered in Sarah's heart for days. Sarah sat by the fire, cradling a cup of hot tea in her hands, staring into the dancing flames. The flickering light cast shadows across the small cabin, and the warmth soothed her tired, aching body. Eliza, now resting comfortably in a thick blanket, had fallen into a deep sleep, her fever finally breaking. Her small chest rose and fell with the gentle rhythm of peaceful slumber. Samuel, too, had been taken care of. After his long walk through the storm, his energy had been spent, and now he lay on a cot, curled up under a pile of blankets, his breathing steady and deep. Sarah watched him for a moment, his small face relaxed, untouched by the anxiety that had once dominated their lives. It was a strange feeling. Peace. It was a peace Sarah had forgotten could exist after days of tension, of constant fear for the safety of her children. The storm had tested them all, but in the end they had survived. They had made it through together. She glanced over at Daniel, who sat at the table, his broad hands cradling a mug of coffee. His face, too, was weary, but the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. They had been through a lot together, but this storm, this had tested them in ways they hadn't anticipated. The worry had gnawed at them both, the uncertainty of whether they would make it out alive, the fear that something, anything, could have gone wrong. But now there was a sense of finality in the air. The storm had subsided, and the world outside was silent, blanketed in the soft, cold glow of the snow-covered mountains. The worst was over. And yet, a lingering unease settled in the pit of Sarah's stomach. The journey wasn't over. They had survived the storm, but there was still so much more to do. Sarah knew that, once they returned to their cabin, they would have to rebuild. The snow had buried everything, their food supplies, their provisions, their sense of normalcy. They would need to find a way to clear the snow, salvage what they could, and make sure they were prepared for the next challenge. The frontier was never truly forgiving. It was a place that demanded strength, resilience, and resourcefulness. She stood up, stretching her sore muscles, and walked over to Daniel. He looked up at her, his expression softened by the firelight. She placed her hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "I'm so grateful, Daniel," she said softly, "for everything. For you, for Thomas, for everyone who helped us. I don't know what we would have done without you." Daniel gave her a tired smile, his rough hand covering hers. "We made it through because we were together, Sarah, and we'll make it through anything else because we still have each other." His words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She had always known that the strength of their family was what mattered most. The storm had tested their bond, but it had only made it stronger. Together, they could face anything the frontier threw at them. Outside, the snow began to fall more gently, as if the earth itself had been softened by the storm's passing. It was quiet now, quiet enough for Sarah to hear the faint sound of a bird chirping in the distance. A small but hopeful reminder that life continued even after the harshest of storms. With a deep breath, Sarah turned back to the fire, her family huddled around her. The worst was over, but the journey ahead was still uncertain. And yet, for the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to believe that they would be all right. The days following the storm were slow, filled with the quiet work of rebuilding and recovery. The snow, though still deep, had begun to settle, and Sarah could finally see the outline of their cabin again, its roof buried under several feet of snow. But the storm had passed, and the sun, though hidden behind clouds, seemed brighter somehow. The air felt different now, as if a weight had been lifted from the land. Thomas and his sons had helped clear the worst of the snow from around the cabin, and they had brought supplies to replenish what Sarah and Daniel had lost. The food stores, once ample, had been buried in the snow, and there was no way to retrieve them, but the kindness of their neighbors had ensured that they didn't have to start from nothing. For that, Sarah would be forever grateful. Eliza had recovered from her fever, though her body remained weak. It would take time for her to regain her strength, but Sarah knew that the hardest part was over. They were safe. They had made it. Samuel, ever the energetic child, had spent the past few days playing with the other children in Thomas's cabin, his laughter filling the air and lifting everyone's spirits. Sarah watched him from the cabin window, his small figure running across the snow-covered yard, carefree and full of life. It was hard to believe that only days ago they had been trapped in a dark, cold tunnel, fighting to survive. But that was the nature of life on the frontier. One moment could be filled with terror, and the next with quiet peace. It was a rhythm so Sarah had come to understand over the years. It wasn't always easy, but it was their way of life. And in the end, it was the only way that truly mattered. As Sarah sat by the fire, watching her family settle into a new routine, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The worst of the storm was behind them, and with that the fear, the uncertainty, and the desperation had faded. Now, it was time to rebuild, not just the cabin, but their lives. She turned to Daniel, who was sitting beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. "We're going to be okay, Daniel," she said softly. "We've made it through the worst of it, and we'll keep moving forward, one day at a time." Daniel squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with quiet strength. Together. Together. That was what had carried them through. That was what would carry them through anything the future held. As the fire crackled and the wind howled softly outside, Sarah knew that no matter what came next, as long as they had each other, they could face it. The storm had passed, and now a new beginning awaited.